Morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us. My name is Sandeep Gokhale, and I'm here today with my colleagues Mike Sherrod and Sarah Martin. We have roughly 1,800 people registered for today's webinar, which perhaps reinforces the importance of our topic. The format for the morning is as follows. We'll present from 9 a.m. to just about 10 a.m. and then answer questions until about 10:30 a.m. If you have a question for us, please type it in the Q&A box on your screen and not in the chat box, which should be disabled. We'll do our absolute best to answer as many questions as we can. If we don't get to your question, please reach out to us after the presentation. Finally, a recording of this presentation and the slide deck will be on our homepage of our website within a day or so. So let's get started. We're going to break down the session into a couple of different parts. First, I'm going to focus in on the new age union organizing strategies and some early warning signs we should all be aware of. We're then going to change the focus to us as an employer and discuss what we can say and do in terms of how do we respond to a union organizing campaign as well as union chatter in the workplace. We'll then cover how to effectively respond to that unexpected application for certification and cover the key components on how to run an effective campaign. Lastly, my colleague Mike will provide a case law update from various labor boards that could impact our strategies. Now, gone are the days of a 65-year-old white male standing outside of the parking lot waiting to talk to our employees. Unions have upped their game from an organizing standpoint and taken full advantage of how technology has allowed them to connect with more people more effectively than ever before. Now, we would be remiss if we didn't think our employees in our workplace have various chat groups already running and operating, whether that's through a WhatsApp group or a Facebook Messenger group. Think about how easy it is to invite a union organizer into this group and how quickly an organizer can galvanize a group of employees. They can even put a link into the chat group with an electronic union card ready for signing. So within a few clicks, within a few minutes, a union organizer can have an abundance of signed union cards ready to file as part of their application for certification. Now, it's important to note on this front that labor boards right across the country have all adopted electronically signed cards. And this, of course, in my view, makes it much easier for a union organizer to now go out there and get the card signed that they need in order to file their application for certification. The last strategy I want to talk about is salting. That's when you get a resume, you get an individual who you interview, you don't know that they're actually being paid by the union, whether they're on staff or they're on contract. They're not there primarily to work for you. They're there to organize your workplace. You hire them. You keep looking out for union organizers outside of your workplace, but you've just hired one internally into your organization. Now, many of us may say that seems highly unethical. Unfortunately, labor boards right across the country have said there's nothing illegal about that practice, because there's nothing illegal about an individual having two jobs. And so we see union organizers and unions getting quite sophisticated in terms of the use of technology, the use of strategy to try and organize and unionize workplaces. Now, in terms of trends, there's a real focus on trade unions focusing in on younger and part-time employees. The taglines we hear from trade unions are community, one for all. Think of Sephora and A&W in Kamloops, BC. Think of the 10 or so Starbucks that have all been unionized across the country. Think about the 2 Tim Hortons that just received applications for certifications last week outside of Ottawa. All of this in the last 20 months. Lots of part-time staff, lots of young employees. It's clear the strategy is to unionize one location and try and use that as a launching pad to try and organize the rest. What we're also seeing in unions do an effective job as in using causes to help organize workers. So, for example, there was a PetSmart that was unionized a few years back in Ontario. And the organizing campaign had nothing to do with terms and conditions of employment. It ultimately had to do with how the employees perceived the pets being treated and the animals being treated. And they used that as the launching pad to organize the workplace. Now, there have been several high-profile organizing campaigns south of the border, where unions have focused on certain comments that a CEO, say in Seattle, has made about a war, and a union is using that in their attempts to organize employees in Wisconsin. They're taking these themes, they're taking whatever is resonating with an employee base, especially a younger employee base, and saying that's not right. This is why you need to ultimately unionize. Things outside of terms and conditions of employment and how their day-to-day work is impacted, and more about what's happening from a global perspective. And then the obvious strategy has been addressing inflation and the significant increases to minimum wage in various provinces in Canada. Most provinces have increased significantly. We're seeing anywhere from 3.5% to 5% increases annually on minimum wage. So I had a recent union organizing campaign, the steelworkers, and I thought they had quite effective materials. And what they did was simplicity works. They had a bag of apples priced in at 2021. They had a bag of apples priced in at 2024. They showed a 17% increase on the same bag of apples. And the question they asked was, have your wages increased by 17% during this period of time? If not, you've fallen behind. And think about our employees, think about our staff, and how that may ultimately resonate with our employees. The other thing that unions have done a really good job of is they've embraced social media. They know the attention span of our employees, especially our younger employees, has shrunk. And they create content that is no longer than 30 to 40 seconds. And it's quite effective. This is where we as employers need to reconsider our strategies in terms of communicating with our employees. I just don't think two-page letters are as effective as they used to be. They should still form part of our strategy, but our employer colleagues in the US, I think, have done a good job of actively building out apps and social media platforms to respond to union organizing campaigns. And I think we need to consider incorporating these tools into our strategies moving forward. I want to just turn to, when we talk about 30 and 40-second clips, we have some examples that we just want to walk you through that are all publicly available on TikTok. And what they ultimately do, what I want you to pay attention to, is the demographics of the people talking. I started off by saying, gone are the days of the 65-year-old white male union organizers. And these videos are indicative of just that.
A union is an organized group of workers who use their collective power as leverage to make demands that improve their lives.
Hi, I'm a union organizer, and here are the top 3 reasons why you and your coworkers should form a union at your workplace. Reason number...
Hi everyone, I brought some donuts. You all are...
Because it's iconic. And I love to do iconic shit. Because it's like...
If you want to form a union and you don't know how to do that, you want to start with something called charting.
So there you see. You see examples of quick snippets that get people excited, that get people wanting to learn more. And I think unions have done a good job of making union organizing kind of cool. The next example I want to highlight is this just comes from the Instagram page of the Steelworkers. And I think the Steelworkers have done a very good job of creating a brand of helping. And what they're focused in on as they try and expand the workplaces that they unionize is focusing on individuals who are new to Canada. So they've got significant amount of programs that help with simple things like, how do I get my healthcare card? How do I get a license? How do I make sure my work permit's up to date? Helping with any immigration issues, helping with rental agreements, helping with, educating a new individual to Canada on what it takes and what they need to ultimately get set up here. It's a long game because these are the people who are now going to get jobs working in industries that they ultimately want to unionize. And so they're on brand where they're helping people come in, helping people get set up, ultimately in the hopes that they create that relationship. And so when an individual starts his or her first job in Canada, they know who they can reach out to if they ultimately need support and help. Again, we got to look at our workforce and really consider, where do they spend their time? And I think a lot of our employees spend their time on Instagram, and they spend a lot of their time on Reddit. And this just shows you, this is another example of how easy it is to get information on how to unionize, how to organize, what your rights are in terms of the organizing process. There's an anonymous group set up where you can literally ask any questions, and answers are provided within an hour. You'll get a response, and there's lots of discussion and chatter there with links and information. So it just shows you how quickly information can transmit and how quickly individuals can get interested in a union organizing campaign. This is a phenomenal app that the SEIU has created. And what it does is, oftentimes an individual who may be unionized may think, what is my union doing for me? Well, if I'm a member of the SEIU, I can go into my app and it'll have up-to-date information on recently negotiated collective agreements. It'll have information on health and welfare benefits. It'll have information on any rallies. It'll have information on legislative changes that the SEIU is trying to ultimately get changed. And it'll have information on their own personal pension plans, all stored in this one app. So if I'm an individual and I'm an employee, I can just go to this app, and what the SEIU is trying to sell is that this is your one-stop shop for everything you ultimately need. So it's a good tool. It's helpful for individuals, and it just shows you that the SEIU is creating and investing in themselves to ultimately expand the scope of their membership base. So when we start to look at all of the things that unions have done and how they've changed and how they've developed their organizing strategies, one thing we have to remember is a union is a business. The only way unions ultimately generate revenue is through union dues. They can increase that revenue by either increasing union dues or increasing their membership base. And we're starting to see the increase in the membership base as they focus more and more on part-time service sector industry jobs that are ultimately growing in our country. So they've focused on themes, they've really focused on the inflation piece, and we're starting to see that actually be implemented to some levels of success for unions. I now want to turn to the early signs of internal organizing. And right now, it's much harder to pick up on. And one of the reasons why is because so much of organizing takes place on people's phones and outside of the workplace. It used to be a time where you thought you had an organizing campaign when you turned a corner in an aisle and you saw 3 or 4 employees, talking, looking scared, and they, scatter away. It's much harder now when all of the communications are done via a social media platform. And this is something that employers have to respond to. And one of the responses is employers just need to be proactive in terms of the level of engagement, in terms of communication. They need to have certain strategies implemented so that there's forums where people can talk about what's working and what's not working, and not wait till we get an application for certification. We all want a motivated and engaged, passionate workforce, but employers have to be proactive in terms of how we ultimately address that. Oftentimes we don't have the time. We have certain provinces that have moved to card-based models, and there isn't going to be an opportunity for some of us to actually respond, which means we got to be more proactive. Surveys are great, but they're just one tool. I oftentimes have concerns because if we get 60%, 70% of a response, that means 30% are so disengaged they couldn't even take time to fill it out. I'd much rather have a higher percentage in terms of people responding and have more negative information, because that way at least we have the information and data we need to make corrections and to make changes in the workplace. There are kind of 2 buckets of issues I want to address here. Some are external signs of organizing and external things that can impact whether or not we have organizing going on in our workplace. One is, do we have another unionized location either in the country, in the province, south of the border, that can actually impact us? Because unions will use what is negotiated elsewhere as proof or as evidence in terms of trying to convince and persuade people that they should ultimately become a member of a union. We also look at the industry. Just this week, a distribution center run by Walmart was unionized. And we've received several calls from various distribution center clients in the last 3 or 4 days saying, are we at risk now? And the short answer is absolutely. Anytime there's a high profile employer who gets unionized in your industry, the union's not going to just stop there. They're going to use that to ultimately try and create more support across various different employers. And then, of course, there's global circumstances. There's issues completely outside of the control of us as an employer that impact whether or not a union ultimately will try and organize our workplace. Rising gas prices, rising cost of goods that are created because of circumstances completely out of our control lead to potential organizing in our workplace. And then the focus turns to the internal bucket, which are things that we have 100% control over. Our leadership, favoritism in the workplace or perceived favoritism in the workplace, organizational decisions that may not be popular. How are they communicated? How are they rolled out? And of course, wages and benefits is still always going to be a factor in terms of what could lead to early signs of union organizing. Common mistakes or pitfalls that employers make, it always stems from a change of policy. And the mistakes can come from a couple of different places. And we've seen several organizing campaigns that stem from a change of vacation policy, or a change of sick day policy, or a change of scheduling. And one of the biggest issues that oftentimes arises is the lack of communication that is rolled into the change. If there's a change that the employer makes and they just put it up on their intranet system, that's not going to land well with our employees. Employees want to be in the know. They want to better understand. They can wrap their arms around the decision if they understand why it's being made. They may not agree with it, but if we can at least explain to them why this decision is being made and roll it out with some sort of other positive change, that goes a long way for an employer. Soliciting feedback on it so that it's not something that is implemented tomorrow. We're giving people lots of notice. We're having information sessions or listening sessions as it relates to that. I know we're all busy. I know that ultimately it's hard to get people all in one room, but we can be creative in terms of how we roll things out and the level of input that we receive from our employees as it relates to these changes. The other piece that we often talk about are not acting quick enough. We have an organizing campaign that started 6 months ago. We had survey results that all talked about the leadership issues in the workplace. We didn't act on it. It wasn't addressed quick enough. Employees gave us a fair bit of time to make those changes, but because of the geographical location of the workplace, we didn't want to make a leadership change, and now we're scrambling because employees are upset. They said, look, we took time out, we filled this out, we were very clear, we were transparent in terms of what the issues are, and there's been no ultimate changes in the workplace. So I think oftentimes employers sometimes sit on information too long and don't act on it quick enough. And I get it, we're busy, we have multiple locations that we're trying to manage, and some things fall through. And this is ultimately one of the issues that leads to it. These stats come out of the US, and they're bang on with what ultimately we see here in Canada as well. In terms of the issues that lead to successful union organizing campaigns, we may think it's wages and terms and conditions and pensions and that sort of thing. It's really not a high priority for employees in terms of what they ultimately leads them to seek out a union. It really stems from things like dignity, respect. Am I being heard? Am I being valued? Working conditions is still an issue where a significant portion of employees don't feel safe going to work. And those are the issues that ultimately lead to unions being successful and employees reaching out to a union, and not so much the wages, the terms and conditions, and that sort of thing. So as we start to wrap up in terms of the organizing piece of this and the early warning signs, put them into different buckets. Employee attitude. How can we assess that? Is it a feel thing? Is it a survey issue? Is it town hall meetings? Is it small information sessions? Are they periodic? Are they every quarter? Or are they annual? If they're annual, that may not give us enough time, especially with the turnover among staff, that we're starting to see in certain sectors. So start to look at that piece. We talk about employee communications. How can we communicate? Are face-to-face meetings the best way? Can we do virtual meetings? Can we do information sessions? Can we do social media platforms in terms of our ability to communicate? We can be as creative as we want, but I don't think we can drop the ball in terms of not communicating with our employees, especially right now. And then lastly, let's look at our employee behavior, right? Are we doing exit interviews as people leave our workforce? There's valuable information in getting why somebody is ultimately leaving, so we can change that. We know that when somebody leaves our workplace, there's significant cost in replacing that person. So let's try and better understand why people are making that leap to go somewhere else. From a conduct perspective, are we starting to get questions about a defined benefit pension plan on a random Tuesday? Are we starting to get questions about our LTD plan that are just coming out of the blue? Chances are that they're talking to somebody as it relates to these issues that don't typically arise, on a daily basis. So let's consider that. Let's look at that, and let's not just ignore some of these questions, and let's focus in on what these behaviors actually do. It may just be disgruntled employees, it may be curious employees, or we may be in a union organizing campaign. But either way, we can't put our head in the sand. We should probably look to address these issues head on. I now want to turn it over to my colleague, Sarah, who's going to focus on us as an employer and what rights do we have.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Sarah McKay Martin, and I'm a lawyer here at Sherrod Coos. Today, in this next section, I'd like to take us through, now that you've heard Sandeep's part, you've heard about union organizing, what actually happens when an employer sees organizing, and how can you speak to your employees about it? So before I flip to this next slide, just take a moment to ask yourself, can you actually talk to your employees about unions? Just a simple yes or no in your head. Okay, and if you've answered yes to that question, what do you think you can say to them? So there are a few very common myths that we hear, particularly from our clients when they first start to see union organizing, that employers need to remain neutral when talking about unions, or even that employers can't talk to employees at all about unions. Some of them feel that if questions about unions come up, they should walk away, shut down the conversation. But the truth is, this is as far from what we want you to be doing as possible. If you hear your employees talking about unions, we want you to be able to communicate with them effectively and efficiently and stay within the bounds of the law. So as I move into this next slide, one of the things to remember is that most of what we're talking about here applies only to Ontario. So while there's some overlap across provinces in terms of free speech restrictions and in terms of timelines, which we'll set out a few of as we go, when it comes to your workplace and a specific scenario, you should really be reaching out to legal counsel to make sure that whatever conversations you're having or interactions with your employees fit within the bounds of your province. For example, Ontario tends to be a little more flexible, whereas Manitoba can be quite restrictive. So as I take you through this acronym on the screen, I'd like to start by pretending we have a question from an employee. Let's say it's Monday morning, an employee walks into your office and they say, "Hey, a union organizer asked me to sign a union card. What do you think I should do?" Here are the things you should not say to your employees. You cannot threaten them. So, Sarah, if someone asked you to sign a union card and you signed it, I'm going to fire you. That's a pretty bad one you want to stay away from. But threats don't necessarily have to be that explicit. They can be implicit threats like, "Oh, I don't know, if enough people sign union cards, I'm not so sure the business is going to do well." That's pretty indicative that you're thinking, okay, if we unionize, maybe we'll close this location. You also can't interrogate employees. So employee comes to you and says, "What should I do?" You don't say, "Well, who asked you to sign a card? When did they ask you? Where were you? Do you know if any of your coworkers have signed cards?" We want to make sure employees don't feel like they're being questioned and pressured to share information. If they choose to share information from you completely voluntarily, that's another story. And we'll talk a little bit more about how we can do that. You also can't make promises to employees. So the opposite of threatening them, if you say, Sarah, if you don't sign a union card, I promise you'll get that promotion. I promise you'll get the best parking spot. I promise you will never have to work overtime if you don't have to, or maybe you can work all the overtime you want to. These are all things you can't do when employees are speaking to you about unions. You also can't make promises to change things in the workplace. So like Sandeep was speaking about earlier with leadership, if you wait until you get an application for certification to start to make changes, and for example, say, oh, if the problem is this leader in the workplace, I promise I'm going to fire them. You can't do that either. And finally, the last one we want you to stay away from is spying. So if you feel that your employees are organizing, or maybe you hear they're meeting after work, please don't go, get the booth next to them at the restaurant down the street and start listening in. Or maybe it's as simple as you see employees speaking to each other on break and they're having a conversation about union organizing. Don't linger too long to listen and overhear them. So generally speaking, if you remember these tips, you should stay within the bounds of the law. Now, I've told you a lot about what you can't say to your employees, but what can you say? You're allowed to express an opinion on unions. So you can say things like, I hope you don't sign a card, or I don't think you need to sign a card. You can speak about reasons that are personal to your organization and say, we don't need a union, or we don't want a union here because of whatever reason. And when you're doing this, you want to consider what reasons are important to your employees. So one of the things you can say is, we prefer a one-on-one relationship with our employees. Maybe you have a great relationship with them and you have managers who interact well with employees and are comfortable speaking with them. And you can remind them that without a union, they get to continue to have that direct relationship with those managers. It's also important to address whatever the union is saying during an organizing campaign. So Sandeep spent a lot of time talking about how information gets shared with employees. It's important that you digest that information and consider it, because you can remind employees that, unlike employers who aren't allowed to make promises during a campaign, a union can promise whatever it wants to. That said, anything a union promises eventually has to be negotiated with the employer. So just because a union says it's going to happen doesn't mean an employer is going to agree. One of the most important things you can say to your employees, and we'll spend some time going through what this actually means, is please vote. If you find yourself in a position where you receive an application for certification, you want to make it incredibly clear to employees that they will have the opportunity to express their opinion on whether they want a union in the workplace by voting, and you can encourage them to do so. You can also remind employees about union dues. So oftentimes employees might not have any information about unions or what they are or how they operate, and they may never have considered what union dues are or where they come from. You can also remind them that signing a union card and voting are two different things. So when you're communicating with your employees, these are sort of the main things you want to keep in mind. We want to be responsive to our employees' needs. So understanding what they need, what are the issues, and making sure you're present and available to them if they need you. So one of the first questions we usually ask if we see a client receive an application for certification is, what leaders need to be present in the workplace? Are the people who should be talking to your employees already there? Are they on site? Is there a manager who suddenly decided that, they can work remotely 4 days a week and only be in the office once? These are all things to consider to make sure that when you're communicating with employees, they get the information they need to get from the right people. And when we're providing that information, we need to ensure it's tailored to the audience. So what issues matter to them? Has there been feedback that's come up over the last year, month, week, however long, that's important to address head on? You want to figure out and unpack what those issues are so that you can give answers. And when you do give answers, you might not be able to fix the problem right away. And you certainly can't promise that you're going to fix the problem. But that said, you can talk to them about strategies, about things you've done in the past, about understanding why these issues have come up. And if you're unable to answer that question, the most important thing to do is to make sure you eventually get employees an answer, or you find someone who can give an answer. Nothing frustrates someone more than saying, oh yeah, I hear your feedback, I understand you, I'll get back to you, and then never doing it. That's one of the main things we see when we see union activity start to pop up in workplaces. Finally, one of the most important things you can do is emphasize the positive. Often when we see union organizing, we see this sort of us versus them attitude. It becomes the company versus the union, or the company versus the employees. But you want to make sure you're emphasizing what's great about your workplace. What are the wins you've had recently? What are the things you can point to show that employees should trust you and rely on the relationships they've already developed in their workplace? So some of the other important things to consider when speaking about unions or when in a union campaign, you want to make sure you continue to enforce things consistently. If you suddenly receive an application for certification, now is not the time to start disciplining employees for things you've never disciplined for before, or to stop doing so. It's really business as usual from an operations perspective. And this includes treating everyone equally. So if you suddenly see employees in the workplace who are very vocal about supporting a union, you can't suddenly start to treat them poorly, ignore them, or get frustrated with them because of that reason. On the other hand, if you see employees who are very vocal about supporting the company and not wanting a union to be present in the workplace, don't suddenly start favoring those employees, because that'll make everyone pretty mad. One of the things you can do is prohibit union activity during working time. So if your employees are suddenly, gathering to talk about the union, taking time off of their paid shift to gather signatures, to speak to organizers, whatever it is they're doing, you can prevent them from doing that, but only with one caveat. Really, it needs to be treated like any other solicitation. So if you have a culture where your employees can, bring a signature page to work and ask for donations for their cause of choice, or let's say you let your employees run a fantasy football league in the middle of the day and you let them talk about that. These things have to be roughly treated the same, and you have to be careful about having clear policies in terms of enforcing solicitations. Now, one thing you can do is prohibit professional organizers from actually trespassing on your property. So if there are union organizers paid by the union who come to your workplace and prevent your customers from coming in, are preventing your employees from doing their work, or actually coming onto your property, you can ask them to stop and or leave. You can also remind employees that if they feel uncomfortable or pressured, that it's something they can speak to you about, because you can take action if that occurs. Other than that, it's pretty much business as usual, and you want to make sure you continue speaking to your employees regularly. Now, as a recap to some of the things you can't do, and these all follow tips, are asking employees whether they signed a union card or know if others did. That's a pretty clear violation of our second one, which is interrogation. Similarly, you want to make sure you're not asking employees about internal union affairs or union meetings. This can get tricky if you do have employees who come to you and voluntarily want to share information, but the key there is to make sure that if you're speaking to employees about unions, they're speaking to you because they want to, and it's completely voluntary. You can also make clear that if you're meeting with employees, they are welcome to leave at any time. There's no negative inferences drawn if they don't want to talk to you about the union, and all around make clear that whether they support the union or not is their choice. And this leads us to the next point, which is one of the most important, which is do not discriminate against union supporters. You also can't encourage employees to revoke their membership. So for example, if employees are talking about signing cards, you don't want to go to them and say, oh, well, you can always write to the union and tell them that you don't want that card signed anymore. That's really something that's between them and the union. But what you can do is make sure they understand that signing a card doesn't mean they voted for the union. And what they can do later on is actually vote. And importantly, these two both fall under threats. You want to make sure that you're not threatening to close your business or saying that if you become unionized, you will refuse to deal with the union. These are very clear violations that could be found to have intimidated employees into voting against a union. So moving into this next section, Taking all of these things I've just talked about and sort of the tips for speaking about unions, what can you actually do when you see union organizing in your workplace? So the number one thing we say is support your leaders, train them, educate them, make sure they are comfortable talking about unions. It's easy for me to stand up here and go through the laws, but what you really need to do is have your leaders get comfortable and practice speaking about unions. Do practice questions with them, just like I did at the beginning, where I said, if I signed a union card, what should I do? Have them see if they can answer that question. You also want to make sure you're empowering your frontline leaders. So we're not just looking at management. We're not just looking at people who would typically be considered, leaders. Look at people who are on the floor, who are interacting with the employees that the union is targeting as part of their campaign, because those are the people that your employees trust. And as you're picking your leaders who are going to be having these conversations, you want to make sure that you're looking at and examining the relationships that exist in the workplace. Are there relationships that have dwindled? Are there employees that suddenly feel like, there have been issues between them and their manager, and maybe this is a reason for organizing? Or is there someone in the workplace that employees trust and listen to? You can evaluate who best can communicate the company's message and who most comfortably can speak about unions. And these are all things to consider. It's also important to do a review of what's been going on in your workplace over the last little while. This helps us sort out what the important issues in the campaign are, but it also helps you do things like, review impactful decisions. So have there been disciplines, terminations, any investigations in the workplace? And you can also look at things like payroll issues or organizational changes. Now, as you're launching your own sort of way to speak about unions and to interact with your employees, you want to make sure you're also looking for quick wins. So are there things in the workplace that you've been ignoring recently that you can address that might help your employees feel like you've been listening to them? So it can be as simple as cleaning up a washroom, changing out uniforms, or maybe there's a policy that needs to be revamped. Ultimately, you want to listen to your team and make sure you're educating them accordingly. So targeting the things that they are coming to you to speak about. You might have employees in your workplace who actually don't even know what a union is. And that's a pretty important question to answer up front. They might have other questions like, what does signing a card mean? Or what are union dues? And these are all things that you should learn how to address and speak to them about. And finally, one of the things you can do as a strategy is start researching. Know who's speaking to your employees, know what their causes are, find out what unions are near your business or what union is speaking to your employees, and you can determine what's been going on in your industry or in your geographic location to see what you might be able to expect in a campaign. One of the things you want to be doing behind the scenes as this is going on is assessing your leaders for their strengths and weaknesses. So you might have leaders who can very comfortably speak about one topic and completely panic in the other. Or maybe you have leaders who are much better at the admin and the behind the scenes versus actually speaking to employees. Make sure you know who those people are and speak to them about how they can work through this process with you. Now, on the sort of more legal side of things, you can also start preparing for a response to an application for certification. So making sure you have updated employee lists, which set out things like their email addresses, contact information, and other helpful things like their shift schedule, their classifications, the managers they report to. It's important for you to know who's in your workplace, when they're there, and where they are, so that you make sure if you need to get information to them, you're able to do so. There are also some things like contact information that eventually you would need to provide to the labor board, and it can be pretty tough to scramble to get 100 employee emails in a day. Finally, and on that note, you can also do things like prepare your draft response to your application or update what's called a 5-day plan. So later on, Mike is going to talk a little bit more about this, but generally speaking, when we say 5-day plan, we refer to the strategy that you will look to if you do receive an application. And we call it a 5-day plan because you generally have 5 days between when you receive an application versus when employees are set to vote. So you can sort of map out your steps as you go. Now, on that note, I'm going to take you through the legal parameters for actually receiving and responding to an application for certification. And again, most of what I'm speaking about is Ontario, but we'll sort of show the distinction here on this slide. So there is a difference in Canada between card check certification and vote-based certification. So in certain provinces like British Columbia and Quebec, we have what's called card check certification. That means all the union has to do is gather signed cards from employees to show that it has enough support to file an application with the Labor Relations Board and eventually become certified. Alternatively, there are provinces like Ontario where we have vote-based certification. So that means that after the card signing stage, the union files an application and then the labor board directs a vote to happen where employees actually get to vote on whether they want a union in the workplace. And in Ontario, that process looks like signed membership cards being gathered. These cards are used to show evidence that employees support having a union. And these cards can last for up to 1 year. So as soon as these cards are being gathered, if you know that you're having organizers in your workplace who are looking for signatures, you could have anywhere between then and a year where those signatures are still valid and able to be used to apply to certify your workplace. And Sandeep really touched on this earlier, but it's important to consider that these cards are no longer the physical pieces of paper we're used to, and electronic membership evidence is accepted. So just breaking that down here, we've talked about the card signing stage, and in Ontario, a union needs 40% of employees to sign cards to be able to apply to certify a workplace. Once that application happens, we typically see a vote about 5 business days later. And then the actual vote itself, and this is something you want to make very clear to employees, is that the outcome of the vote is based on a majority of only those who cast a ballot. So even if you have 100 workers in your workplace, if only 10 employees show up to vote and 6 vote for the union, you will be unionized. And every employee who's been applied for in that bargaining unit will be unionized. So that's 50% plus 1 of employees who vote. And up here on the screen, we've got a little bit of an example of what that union card might look like. So this is the actual card signing stage before an application is filed. It's pretty simple, not a lot of information goes into there, but you'll see on this bottom one, unions might also ask for questions like classification or shift or department, and that helps them figure out who should be part of a bargaining unit. Now, when a vote is actually conducted by the Labor Relations Board, it's done by an electronic secret ballot vote. So in the left here, we've got an example of what a paper ballot used to look like, and that's to show you what the actual question on the ballot would be. And we like to show these examples because it's important for employees to see what something might look like. If the first time they're looking at a ballot is when they're actually voting, it feels that much more unfamiliar to them. So if you know what questions they're going to be asked, you can let them know what questions they'll be asked. So very simple question. It says, in your employment relations with your employer, do you wish to be represented by the union? And then down here, we've got an example of the web page that the Labor Relations Board will send to you if you're going to vote in that electronic vote. So when you actually receive an application for certification, we often hear the myth that if you don't see it coming, you cannot win. And while we always want to say, be prepared, think ahead, start as early as you can, even if the first time you're hearing about a union is when you actually get that application for certification, take a deep breath, don't panic, pay attention to when you might be receiving that application, because the worst thing you can do is miss it entirely and miss the window to respond. So as a brief summary, the things that you want to know if you do receive an application and the things you want to communicate to your employees when you do is that receiving an application does not mean that you are unionized. All it means is 40% of your employees have signed union cards. And in fact, they might not even know what they signed or what the union card meant. Sometimes we're seeing unions communicate that employees have to sign union cards to be able to vote if there's a vote that happens. So What you should be explaining next and is important to emphasize is that they will likely have the opportunity to vote in 5 days. And using that vote, they can express their opinion on whether they feel there needs to be a union in their workplace. It's also important for you to understand the next 5 days are going to be pretty tough on your business. It's going to take up a lot of your time. You're going to be putting a lot of resources into this campaign. So it's also important to consider whether there are leaders in your workplace who are not involved in the union organizing efforts that you can assign to make sure your business continues to operate smoothly. At the end of the day, you need to act quickly and make decisions. So gather your information, plan for what's coming next, and ensure that any colleagues you need are available. You can also always contact your legal counsel, and in fact, we encourage you to do so to make sure that you have all of the information you need to prepare a response. So for this next section, my colleague Mike is going to hop on and take you through running a successful campaign.
Hi, good morning all. My name is Mike Sherrod, and in the last part of this workshop this morning, we're going to take you through running a successful campaign, and then we're also going to comment on recent labor board decisions that have an impact or give us some guidance with respect to the kind of campaigns that are lawful versus when a campaign might be in a point of risk. With respect to running a successful campaign, this morning I'm going to try to take you through 5 areas. High notes, and I'll try to connect it back to some of the comments my colleagues have talked about this morning. The first one is that one of the very basic principles, if you receive an application for certification, is to try to figure out how you can maximize the voter turnout. And remember a couple of things. Sarah said to you that when an application comes in and a vote occurs, whether the union is to win the vote or not, they win the vote if they get 50% plus one of those who cast ballots having voted yes for a union. So that means that at least our experience has been the most amount of employees that you can encourage lawfully and get them to go and vote, the better off you are as an employer. That statistically is what's happening. That means that up front, we need to figure out how to make this process something that the employees have never seen before traditionally. How do we make this process have some familiarity, some comfort, not be such a strange thing? And that means we would recommend that you talk to your employees about that pending vote. So this is on the assumption, again, that you've received an application. And we think part of this is communicating with those employees about how critical it is to come and vote. And remember, when I say come and vote, it's an electronic vote these days, at least in Ontario and a number of the other provinces. I know BC, as an example, for sure has endorsed this. So some of that is upfront planning. Some of that is also assigning work to people to encourage people to come and vote. That means it might be texting, it might be phone calls, might be some form of social media that Sandeep had talked about as well. Again, some clients are actually doing pop-up websites. So they get a website ready, it remains dark, but it's there in case they need a tool to communicate effectively with the workforce. So that's focusing on the turnout. And nothing unlawful about that at all. You saw some of those things that Sarah said, and I'll just paraphrase one of them. You know, there's going to be a vote next Monday, and we really encourage you to come out and vote. It's your right to vote. We respect your vote. Either way, we've got to tell you, as a company, we hope you will vote no to the union for the following reasons. Nothing that I just said will put you anywhere near a risk, but it will help us getting that turnout. The next piece is education. Education, we think, is really critical because most of our clients don't want to be seen as anti-union or committing any kind of decision that might be seen to have an element of anti-union animus in it. And so what kind of a campaign or what kind of a message and a communication platform do you want to have with your employees? And today's employees, they're all bright, they're all inquisitive, they all come from different backgrounds. So you have to know who's in front of you and who you're talking with. But we first say things like, we're pro-choice. We respect your right to sign a union card. We respect your right to not sign a card. As we're coming into the vote, we respect your right to vote no, to vote yes. We'll respect the choice. But we've got to tell you, as a company, really all we want is before you make your decision, get all of the facts. And hopefully, if you're the employer saying what I've just talked about, you're already the trusted source of information. Over your years or months with your employees, you've decided you will always go find the answers for them. And you've become now the trusted source that they go to all the time, no matter what the topic is. That's the kind of platform or the relationship you want to create in your workplace. We do have to have a rationale. If we're hoping to convince employees to vote no or to not sign union cards, you want to think about it from the employee's perspective. And what we've found very effective is to point at situations or circumstances over the last period of time in your workplace where employees have spoken up and you've made changes to things you do, and or you've simply made it a better workplace. And you want to point to, we don't see a need to have a union when we have an effective communication between each other. We listen really well. We don't always make changes every time, but we do listen, and we want to get better so that they have a reference point that says they don't need a union to represent them. They're actually getting effective change by simply talking to their leaders in the company. Some people will traditionally look at the union and they'll talk about all the negatives of the union. We see that in political campaigns, right? The negative attacks. We don't think that's very effective. We may still talk about union dues that you heard Sandeep talk about, and we always want to put them in a tangible format. So instead of 2 to 2.5 hours is sort of the equivalent of what dues will cost them, or 2.5% a year of their regular pay. We want to actually show them the numbers. And then this final bullet is all about, we want you to be present and accessible. From an application receipt to a vote, there's tons and tons of questions. And so high visibility, and I don't mean fly 4 people in and let them work on your distribution floor for the entire week, because that can create some problems too. I mean, encourage your leaders. Train your leaders, first of all, on the do's and don'ts that Sarah talked about, but encourage your leaders to be present and available to people. The smallest question, the smallest issue, it may be number 20 on my list, the leader, as I listen, but it might be number 1 for that particular employee, and we need to pay attention to those kind of things to see if there are potentially quick wins. Next, strategic communication. You heard lots from Sandeep, and I really do want to emphasize, you create some expectations as an employer. So don't create your own social media campaign as you receive an application. Have a communication medium or mediums plural that the employees are used to going to get current information, and then leverage those and use them to your best effect. Sandeep's point was great. The 4-page letters don't work. At least we don't think they work. I think they have to be 1-page max, but you also have to think of, could I have a pop-up website? Could I have a video from one of our leaders that I can send to the home in the middle of that campaign? Voluntary employee meetings. There's a lot of worry in the case law around our country right now about whether it's lawful to have a meeting. And you'll hear trade unions talk about captive audience meetings being unlawful. That's why in front of the word employee meetings, what you see from us is voluntary. There's nothing wrong with holding a meeting with your employees between application and vote, provided it's voluntary. They know what the topics are that are going to be covered. And again, it's a way to get some discourse going back and forth. Leaders have to be well trained to lead those kind of meetings. But again, it's another vehicle to communicate. And we've found them to be very effective in terms of potentially succeeding in those votes. Celebrate past wins. We forget sometimes. Remember my comment about sometimes we go negative on unions and we focus on that. We'd rather see you focus on your wins. Focusing on the wins and talking about how the grass might be green on your side of the road, we've found to be very, very beneficial. And you've got to remember who your audience is as you're picking those wins to try to demonstrate a lack of need for a trade union. And then at the end of the day, this goes without saying, but it's so, so important. You're trying to be seen as leaders to be the trusted person in that workplace. So your authenticity is important. And that means 9 times out of 10, we're not perfect. We have to own up to our mistakes. And a campaign won't go by half the time where somebody will say, sorry, we messed that area up, but we've learned from it, and this is what we've done. So things to think about as you get ready to go into a campaign. You're much better off if you've done some of what we've talked about this morning in advance, but at the same point, you can do it on the fly in those 5 days. It is doable. There are lots of resources around the country this firm can help you with any of that at a moment's notice, frankly, because we're well positioned in terms of teams who can help you when you've received an application for certification. We move next, maximizing your credible resources. The reason we talk about that is I go right back to trust. And if you think I've said it too many times, I hope not, because trusted leaders are how one remains in a position where you'll succeed in a vote, or you'll succeed in your employees not signing enough cards to get to that, in Ontario as an example, to the 40%, or to a simple majority on the federal side. You want to leverage your goodwill. So in meetings, a shift huddle, a break at lunch, we love to recognize successful employees or successful associates or team members, depending upon your language. And again, I've already said this, credible source of information, no matter what it is. If an employee says, I think my human rights have been violated, let's go get the human rights code and talk about it. I want to sit beside the employee and I want them to engage in discourse with the leader, as opposed to having called the Human Rights Tribunal, as an example. Proactively, and Sandeep used this too, what's working versus what's not working. That's a great way to engage with people. And it's amazing when you look for both sides of that coin, the kind of feedback you'll get from your people. Hopefully it's not always virtual on a Zoom meeting, that you actually can get back to the face-to-face meetings, the water cooler, the lunchroom, and some of the social media platforms as well. Timely response to questions and concerns, that's really challenging. Many clients have sundown policies or 24-hour policies. If you're in that situation between application for certification and a vote, a lot of people will use a lawyer or a senior HR person to be the quarterback for the week. The quarterback is all about making sure we get information out to people, because sometimes somebody will ask you a question that you wish to convey answers to the entire workforce, and we want to coordinate that. So if we now move to the recent labor board decisions, what we want to talk about here is the labor board is empowered to interpret and apply the Labor Relations Act, the Labor Relations Code, depending upon your jurisdiction. So we have the Canadian Industrial Relations Board for the Federal Canada Labor Code. Here in Ontario, we have the Ontario Labor Relations Board with the power to interpret and apply the Ontario Labor Relations Act. The Ontario Labor Relations Act has a number of rules that really guide the process of how a company might face unionization threats, what a company can do and not do, what a union can do and not do. And we want to talk about 4 or 5 of the key areas that we've seen some movement in the labor board decisions recently. So if we move to the first one, I'm going to pick on this first bullet. You see where it says statutory freeze. The Echo Electric case talks about what is lawful and not lawful, where an employer, in this instance, changed a wage rate for its workforce after the application was received. And they ultimately found, in this case, that change violated the Labor Relations Act because it violated the statutory freeze. What that section says is, upon receipt of an application for certification, an employer should not, and I'm paraphrasing, should not change wages or any other term or condition of employment without the consent of the union until such time as, paraphrasing, the process has been completed. Statutory freeze, as you leave this session today, you should think of as business as usual. And what that means is everything an employer does should be business as usual. You heard Sarah talk about it. We want you to run your businesses. We don't want you to freeze in the middle of an organizing campaign or leading up to a vote. So that may mean there will be change, but it usually needs to fit in some kind of a pattern. So for example, this month, today, September 18th, every year we give wage increases. And this day, September the 18th, you're right in between your application for certification and your vote. You'd still seriously consider putting out those, I'll call it across the board wage increases, but it is something to think about and get some counsel to ensure you're not offside this, because it can go either way. And you're really looking for that pattern and leaning on the pattern. There also can be first-time events. And what the labor board has said, and they say it in Echo Electric as well, is when this occurs, what's the reasonable expectation of the employee? Would they have expected a wage increase at this point in time or not? Would they have expected the vacation scale to change at this point in time or not? And that's what they're looking at. some kind of practice or pattern, or in the first instance, a reasonable expectation of change. We move now to interim orders. Interim orders, it's not new, it's been around for a while, but the Labor Board is fine-tuning the tests around it. What's an interim order about? A long time ago, an employer might think, I could terminate the union organizer. And I say a long time ago, I think those thoughts have long passed us. But if a union organizer was terminated in the middle of a campaign, it would typically send a chilling message to the rest of the employer population. Don't sign a card, don't associate with a trade union, because look at what happened to that other person. It used to take a long time to adjudicate those cases and figure out whether it was an unlawful act or not. And so what Southern Sanitation does most recently, it goes over and fine tunes that test, because now the board under Section 98, at least in Ontario, has an ability, and same with Section 19 on the federal side. In Ontario, it has the ability to have an application served on an employer complaining about some kind of conduct that just occurred in the middle of an organizing campaign, as an example, and require the employer to file a response 2 business days later, and have a litigation process based upon paper. In other words, that means we're now going to compare what the application says happened versus what the employer says happened, primarily on paper. So you'll see that we use the example of an organizer being terminated because that's the most frequent one that happens at the board in terms of that actually gets to a decision and having heard a hearing. It's all really about what makes labor relations sense. In other words, was the employer correct? Did they actually terminate for appropriate reasons, devoid of any element of anti-union animus, and therefore should that decision stand? Now remember, there's a little bit of leaning here because it's an interim order. So there's usually an unfair labor practice in behind this. So you've got an interim application, an interim proceeding, and there is a little bit of leniency in terms of trying to correct something that is alleged to have been done wrong, because it's an interim order, it's not the finished order. But we want to take a look at it. And if we go to the next slide for a moment, there's some real key points here. If you think about the urgency of the matter, and you think about the strengths of the party's case, well, you can't do that if you've simply got Mike Sherrod talking. You need Mike Sherrod or somebody from Sherrod Coos having written really strong pleadings that are detailed, and they provide evidence upon which you've made your decision. Those are really critical because you want to be in front of that board saying, in this situation, I terminated this person for X, Y, and Z. It could be theft, just to pick a topic. They still happen once in a while. But I want to be able to prove it on paper, and that means you spend a lot of time in those 48 hours making sure that you get this correct. So on that next slide on page 44, short timelines, right? Still a lot of onus on the employer to really, really give the board their rationale. You need to clearly set out the wrongdoing of the employee. You must, this could happen too, right? You've terminated somebody, but there's still other people organizing, and you want to point to that. You always want to acknowledge whether or not you even knew the person was a union organizer, because in my experience, like half the time, this comes up after the fact. So something to be aware of there on these interim orders. Just be aware they're out there. They may engage conduct, and therefore you want to engage with counsel and debate before you do something in between these things. If we move now to remedial cert, there are various pieces of legislation across the country that give a board the remedial power to actually certify a company if it's violated the Labor Relations Code or Act in a specific jurisdiction to such an egregious amount. So for example, paraphrasing some of the case law, they would talk about that act by the employer that violates this section, like Section 70 or 72 of the Labor Relations Act here in Ontario, is so grievous, it's chilled the rest of the employee population as it relates to organizing. We put 2 cases up on purpose and gave you cites because we really commend these to you. You heard a lot about us from us earlier today about communicating effectively with people. Price Club's a great case to go read. I simply say that because it was a 6-month campaign. There were 12 to 15 pieces of literature that went back and forth between the company and the employee population, and the board picks those apart. They actually spend time with respect to what they thought was lawful or what got near a risk and so forth. In this case, they don't ultimately exercise remedial cert. They actually, back in those days, it could move it to a vote. And let me back up. Price Club was in a time when if you had more than 55% signed up, it would be a card-based certification. If it was 55 or less, it could be a vote. And that was still, in that context, you still had the risk of being remedial certified if you did something significantly wrong. So the comms in the case, it's a long case, but it's a great place to go look if you're writing and talking to your employees. They even terminated an employee in the midst of that campaign. And the board found their termination was motivated for valid reasons and not even in part by anti-union motivation. So great case to take a look at. Waste control, it's a BC case. Same concept in terms of assessing what happened between the parties during an organizing campaign. And in that case, the owner is found to have made some threats to the union organizers. And I'll paraphrase again, I want to come meet you in an alley. I don't know whether that happened, but it's in that board decision. And the board took issue with that. There was an employee terminated and reinstated. They say that the leadership shunned those active union organizers and sort of isolated them away from the group. And they found that to be a contravention of the labor relations code out there. And they went at some of the permissible and impermissible influential ideas or communications or tactics that we see in these campaigns on both sides, frankly. So we commend waste control to you as well. We move from there. This is an area that we really think you want to pay attention to. So, for example, you saw CNNCP and our federal minister order the parties to go back to work most recently where there was risks of a strike lockout and move the conclusion of their negotiations over to an interest arbitration. First contract arbitration in Ontario is governed by Section 43(2) in the Labor Relations Act. And it says, so let's assume we've lost a vote now and we're now at a bargaining table in that first collective agreement negotiation process. You want to be aware of this area because it's guidelines to your conduct at the table. What essentially 43(2) says, it says if a union can prove that collective bargaining has been unsuccessful because of, and then they list things and they say, because of the employer's failure to recognize the bargaining authority of the union, or the company's failure to take reasonable and expeditious steps to conclude an agreement, or having taken an uncompromising position without reasonable justification or other, then the board can order that the remaining issues outstanding go off to an interest arbitration process. We used to say, if you follow our guidance, we might get an application, but we should never lose a Section 43 case. We're a little worried now because these most recent cases seem to show a leaning toward granting a first contract arbitration than not. We just say leaning, but it's still something to be aware of. Starbucks, one issue left in the collective agreement negotiation, and it was about borrowing. That was about employees moving between sites. And the parties couldn't get to an agreement, and they ultimately looked at the various compromises the trade union was making in bargaining, as opposed to the company's strict single position, can't do this, won't do this, and ultimately found against the company. Very, very tough, I think, but ordered the remaining of the contract to go to first contract arbitration. And then the next one, Mirror Interiors, I use that simply because there are things like, making sure that you do meet with a union in a timely manner, making sure that you're ready to bargain when you get there, crossing your T's, dotting your I's, just watching the process. And I think in some of this, including that uncompromising position without reasonable justification, sometimes catches us. But this is one of those areas that I think we're getting some new case law that we want to pay attention to. We go from there over to the last area. I'm going to talk about this one very, very quickly because if you're doing some of that work that Sandeep and Sarah talked about with respect to that prior prep, looking at lists and so forth, it's very important to figure out who's the target. In other words, who will a union go and try and get to sign cards or not? And sometimes we get caught up in, well, are managers possibly in? Are supervisors possibly in? Many of us have other titles, right? We have like managers in training, we have lead hands, we have team leads. In the old days in retail, we had third key holders who would close the store at the end of the day. This case is where there was a challenge about the lawfulness or the constitutionality of excluding managers. And ultimately, this case, we won't do it justice today, but it's worth taking a look at. This case found that the structure of the code in Quebec that excluded managers from the process of unionization was constitutionally okay. And ultimately, what they said was the 3 bullets at the end: avoid placing managers in a conflict, give employer confidence that managers will represent their interests as opposed to get mixed up with other employees in the pursuit of a common objective of unionization. So that area of law, I think, is still pretty okay, but it's something to look at early. Are your team leads hiring and firing, granting raises, granting vacations, all those kind of things that would show that they have the power to affect the economic livelihood of the other employees? That's usually how they get excluded. In that case law, we think is staying much the same. I think at this point, we're going to turn to questions now. And I know we have a list up. So I think my colleagues are going to join me back on the screen. And Sandeep, you're going to jump in first by the sounds of things?
Absolutely. So some really good questions. Thanks for putting them in the Q&A box. The first question I'm going to address is a question about temp workers and can they vote? And the short answer is it depends. The Labor Board looks at who directs and controls these temp workers while they're working in your workplace. And so there's a seminal case involving Nike and Bauer from several years ago that really the Labor Board in Ontario spends a lot of time critiquing the use of temp workers. And in that particular case, there was on-site supervision of the temp workers. So not only did the employer in that case get 15, 20, 30 temp workers in there, they also hired on-site supervision of those folks from that temp agency. So they hired an on-site supervisor or manager to manage that group. If you don't have that on-site supervision from the temp agency, and chances are, we call the agency and we get the individuals, the number of individuals sent to us, and they're working side by side with our folks and they're taking direction and control from our supervisors, the Labor Board will likely say that they are our employees for the purposes of this application. And yes, they will have the opportunity to cast a ballot. The next question, there's a couple questions about decertifications that I'm just going to bucket into one group. And the questions really stem for, well, we're already unionized. Some of our employees have told us they don't want to be unionized or they're not happy with the union. What can we do? And while you heard my colleagues Sarah and Mike spend considerable amount of time talking to you about how many rights we have as employers to engage and communicate with our employees as it relates to staying union free, unfortunately, our legislation in Ontario doesn't give employers the same amount of rights in terms of our ability to communicate with our employees, because our legislation says we can't initiate or support that application for decertification. So that doesn't mean that we have to just sit on our hands, but it means that we can't tell them, we can't encourage people to do this. We can't walk them through the process. We can't help them fill out the forms. We can't allow them to use work resources to ultimately get the application filed with the Ontario Labour Relations Board. But we can ultimately refer them to certain groups or individuals or websites to get the support that they need in order, and the education that they need. But it largely does have to be a process that's initiated and run by the employees and without the employer support. The other question that I wanted to address was, does an employer get a say in terms of whether or not the vote is electronically done or in person? And I will tell you that in Ontario, the fallback is absolutely going to be that it's an electronic vote. Our firm was involved in one of the few cases in which we were able to convince the Labor Board to run an in-person vote. And the circumstances in that case were we had over 3,000 employees working in 3 different facilities, and we did not have email addresses we didn't capture email addresses or personal email addresses for the 3,000 employees. And so in that case, the Labor Board ultimately agreed to do an in-person vote. but you will need unique circumstances to get yourself in a position to get that in-person vote. The next question I wanted to address is, do we have a voice in terms of who shows up to vote? And the short answer is absolutely. I think you heard my colleague Mike say the statistics demonstrate that the more employees we get out to cast a ballot, the stronger the likelihood that an employer can ultimately win the vote. And so we want to spend considerable amount of time engaging with all the employees. And that includes people on WSIB leave, that includes people on mat leaves, any type of leaves where there's still a connection to the workplace. We want to get on the phone, we want to engage with them, let them know, because they may not know any of this is going on. And so it's important to ultimately spend that time encouraging employees to cast a ballot. And the last question I want to address is, if we're in a campaign and let's just say we've dropped the ball and we've got trust issues, our employees don't trust us, the union's ultimately driving a wedge in all of this and highlighting and showcasing the lack of trust. Look, we've got an uphill battle, because part of winning a campaign is ultimately trusting that the employer, the information we're giving you, the information that we're speaking to, whether it's in a town hall or an information session or in writing, is accurate and true. And if it's not, if our employees aren't believing it, it's going to be a challenge. So my advice to clients who are in situations like this are ultimately to fall on the sword. It's okay to fall on the sword sometimes. It's okay to admit we were wrong, and they have an absolute interest in believing that they shouldn't trust us because of some of the past conduct. But it doesn't mean that we still have to continue to try and persuade them to believe and trust us. Fall on the sword, admit we were wrong. It will go a long way, and it will give us a shot or an opportunity to do a level set with our employees as we move into the heart of a campaign. I'm now going to turn it over to my colleagues, Mike and Sarah, who will address some of the other questions.
Great. Thank you, Sandeep. Let me jump into the first one I hear near the end of the queue, but it's a good question. Can the employer provide translators for employees that have language barriers to ensure they fully understand their rights in this process? Short answer is absolutely yes. How you do it, though, is quite a strategic decision, I think, sometimes. So often we will translate all of our communication material into the other languages that are most having high density in our workplace. But sometimes you got to be careful too, because I think how you communicate to people who have English as a second language is it's got to be respectful. And how you do that, it might be one-on-one. Sometimes we'll actually pick out influential employee leaders in the workplace who are fluent in that language. And we engage them with us, and we have them help with respect to making sure that the information is provided in an understandable manner in their home language. So short answer, long-winded, sorry, but the short answer is yes, we'd always provide translation. There's another question in here that said, I have 500 employees, 200 of them go to the ballot box, and the majority of the 200 vote for the union. Does that mean the entire 500 is unionized? Absolutely, that's the answer, unfortunately. Ergo, why we want to encourage a majority turnout of the workplace. So again, 50% plus one of those who vote, not the entire workforce. So you really do want to push your people where possible to vote. Another question in here, and I won't cover a lot of it, but the question was, what are the rules as it relates to the construction industry? It goes well beyond what we could give you today, but let me give you a couple of tidbits. The construction sector is governed by a subset of the Labor Relations Act. It runs from Section 126 to the end of it. It's primarily focused on card-based. That means in at least our experience, in 99% of the applications we get in construction, the outcome will be decided by how many cards the union submitted to the labor board as it relates to your total employee population within the bargaining unit applied for. A lot of other issues there, but under Section 128, the union gets a choice. They can apply under the Section 8 rules, the industrial rules, where there'll be a vote, but they can also apply under a card-based process under 128. And therefore, in our experience over the last decade, they've always applied in the card-based side of it. And it's all card-based, no vote. So if there are other questions, please feel free to call us on that topic. Let me go to the retail sector to pick on that as well. One of our audience said, what about union organizers? So I take the question to be not one of our inside employees, but a union organizer. Can they enter a retail store? Because a retail store, generally speaking, is public. are what can an employer do if I have an organizer in my retail store who doesn't work for me? Do I have any rights at all? Our advice has always been the retail organizer does not have the right to be in that public store trying to engage people to sign cards while they are working. And so again, a little delicate, right? Because that person also may be a shopper, and how you pick that person off or not is really challenging. Sometimes we're looking at what kind of policies you have as it relates to people being able to advertise or solicit in your store that don't work for you. And you lean on that policy, assuming you've always enforced it consistently. But that's a tougher area. The other one that runs off of that reminds me that Sarah made a comment today about, remember, employees ought not to be organizing on work time. She used work time on purpose because employees can't organize on a break. If two employees are on a break in a lunchroom, that's somewhere where, and they can talk about the unions on that break in the lunchroom, traditionally at least, conservative advice, but I think it's the right way to go. We let that kind of stuff go. So it could be on your workplace site, but on a break. However, if they're on paid time, they should not be organizing. And sometimes that first one has to be subtle. You may not understand the rules of this, but you're not allowed to organize, as opposed to firing somebody on the spot. Again, context driven. I think with that, I'll turn it over to Sarah if you want to grab a couple of these as well.
Sure. Thanks, Mike. So a few of the questions that we've gotten have been about who is actually in a bargaining unit. So when a union files an application for certification, how do we know who they're talking about, who gets to vote? Now, when that happens, we really have to get into a specific analysis of that particular application. But generally, what we can say is you'll want to look at the application itself and see how many employees the union has listed, as well as they'll include the description of the bargaining unit they've applied for. And so that will actually set out the employees they want included. So it might be what we refer to as an all employee unit. And you'll see, all employees of ABC Co. except for managers and supervisors. Or you might see something like if you were in the retirement industry, you could see an application come in that just says, all kitchen staff and cooks of ABC Co. And you're probably wondering, okay, well, if it's just kitchen staff and cooks, does this really make sense? So that's actually a decision that as a company, you can consider whether you want to disagree with the union. And when you actually file your response, you might choose to make an argument of, no, I think there should be more people in the bargaining unit because it doesn't make sense to just have a union representing cooks and kitchen staff. I want my, housekeeping. I want my nurses. I want everyone who could be in the unit involved in that. Or you might go the opposite, where you say it's not appropriate to have everyone in the bargaining unit, and here are the reasons why. Now, that's a lot of information for you to digest without knowing the specifics of what's coming. But realistically, that's one of the decisions you'll want to make as early as possible if you start hearing about an application for certification, and you'd want to reach out directly to legal counsel to see what the impact of that bargaining unit could be. Now, after that decision's been made, you can sort of lean on that to tailor your messaging to your employees as well. So if a union applies for an all-employee unit, you want to make it very clear that this applies to all employees of ABC Co. If it's only a specific unit, you're probably going to get employees asking questions of, what about me? And it's important to not forget them in the campaign. Even if you have employees who won't be voting, they're still very important to your workplace and to whether the union is going to be successful in their application. Now, sort of a tangent of that, one of the other questions we received was that someone recently became aware of a union pushing for HR, payroll, and finance to be included in a bargaining unit. So how do you decide who's exempt? This, again, is another sort of legal analysis of whether someone should be excluded from the bargaining unit. Without going into all of the specifics, some of the high-level things you want to look for are things like, does this person have any impact over people who would be included in the bargaining unit? So do they do hiring, firing? Are they going to be disciplining? In terms of people who are in a union, you want to make sure they're equal to each other, so people don't have power over one another that are in that unit. The other thing to consider is, do they have access to confidential information? So things like financials for the company or labor relations. If you have someone on your payroll who's going to be running numbers for you during collective bargaining, if you're unionized, they can't be in the union because those numbers directly impact the union, and that creates a conflict of interest. So there are lots of things to consider there, and that's certainly not exhaustive, but that gives you a little bit of a taste of that. One of the other questions we received was, how many employees are required to be in a union? So that's a great question. If you're operating a company and you've got, one employee working for you, can you have a union? No, the answer is you need 2 employees for a union, and those employees get to vote. One of the other great questions we got here was, what are the limitations around what you can actually say internally? So I've told you about tips, I've told you how to talk to employees, but if you're sitting at the table and it's all management, what can you say? And this question specifically gets at, what should we be putting in our emails? Now, I wouldn't be a very good lawyer if I didn't give you the following advice, which is, do not put anything in an email that you don't want an adjudicator to read. If you're going to type it out, imagine that a vice chair at the Labor Relations Board is going to be reading that email out in front of you. And if you're not comfortable with that, don't say it. That's the best advice I can give you on that one. The other thing I want to remind everyone of is that when you're having communications about unions, be respectful, be mindful, be sort of aware of how that messaging is going to impact. If you're saying something to a manager and that manager goes and repeats it, is it something that you're proud of? Is it something you want them to say to your employees? If it's not, don't say it. Now, if you have specific questions about things that, you feel, I need clarification on whether I can say this or not, call your lawyer. That's the best advice we can give there as well. I think we're getting some more questions rolling in. So Sandeep, Mike, should I flip it back over to you?
Sure, I can grab one. I'll take the easiest one. And that easy one was with respect to salaried employees. Is there a difference between salaried employees and hourly employees as it relates to their ability to unionize? So in short, can salaried people sign union cards and unionize? And absent what you heard from Sarah earlier, that section 13B around the managerial exclusion and or being employed in a confidential capacity as it relates to labor relations issues, they are allowed to unionize as well. So salaried or hourly, it knocks it out. It goes back to that answer from Sandeep earlier in terms of all the different kinds of people we have in our workforce now. We've really got to look at that. So if you have subcontractors, as an example, who you control on your work site, let's take a look at those too, because they might turn out to be your employees for the purposes of the Labor Relations Act. Maybe the last question I'll catch before we finish up, save and accept, unless Sandeep, you want to jump in with others. There's one question I've found really, really good. It was a question about, I have a yard. In that yard, I have non-unionized workforce, but in the yard next to me, it's a unionized workforce. Easy for them to mix. What do I do to maximize my chances of the unionized population next door not wooing over my folks? And the frank answer is positive employee relations. Probably where we started in terms of a concept for this workshop today. It means taking a look at your terms and conditions of employment. And if you followed Sandeep's chart about why people join, it's not about comp, but it is about making comp neutral. Can you make sure that when you look at that competitor next door, assuming they do, generally speaking, the same kind of work, is your compensation and benefit package comparable without the need to have to join a union? You can't replace being a great leader, the trusted leader who communicates effectively, but try to get that, for sure, that compensation benefit piece neutral, if at all possible.
Yeah, the only thing I'll add to that is go back to that old case study of Stelco and Dofasco. Right, you got next door, one's unionized, one's not. The other one took considerable efforts to ensure, and that making sure you understand what terms and conditions are in the other yard are an important aspect of it. And then to Mike's point, we build on that. We build a culture that works for us.
Well, look, on behalf of my colleagues, I want to say thank you for attending. I think this brings us to the end of today's program. We hope you found it informative. For those of you who are asking, the video and slide deck will be on our website in a day or so. So it will be up, it will be available to you. If we didn't get a chance to answer one of your questions, please drop us a line, an email, anything like that. One of the three of us will get back to you quickly. Our next HR review webinar will take place December the 4th, 2024. Topic still in the design phase, and we'll send out an invitation in due course. If you're on the mailing list, you'll receive that invitation. If you're not on our mailing list yet, and you wish to receive our briefing notes, our newsletters, or invitations to seminars or workshops like this one, please subscribe through our website. It's the big red bar at the bottom of every page. Finally, we'd be grateful if you would fill in the feedback form as well. That helps us with respect to designing those next workshops. It'll pop up on the screen once we close this Zoom webinar. So if you could take a couple of minutes, we'd really appreciate it. Thank you again for joining us today. Have a great day.